hello everybody. It's exciting times for the Anishinabek nations.
As Anishinabek people, we had our own forms of government and ways to help our own people.
The federal government policies and programs we have been operating under are not working for us. Our leaders have been saying for years we want out of the Indian Act. We are now at a place where we can begin to make this happen.
The governance agreement is an agreement between Canada and the Anishinabek nation.
What people need to know is that, what are the kinds of lawmaking powers that are recognized under the agreement? So the first one is elections. So this will give us the authority to elect our leadership under our own election laws. Citizenship is really important. Having the power recognized to develop our own citizenship laws and, of course, generate our own citizenship lists. Culture is important because the cultural ceremonies we use, we govern ourselves, our legal staff, our sunrise ceremony, our medicines, our belt. This last one is just having our own power to do things that other governments do, like have a financial management act.
This government's agreement with Canada will formally recognize what we have always known, that we have the right to govern ourselves.
We would control what kind of action would happen, what kind of laws. If we can get back to that, everything in our culture will lead us to a good life.
But what we've been able to negotiate and ultimately change in this agreement is a substantial increase in funding. I say a 7-fold increase in funding. What that money means is the capacity now for you to start dreaming about what it is you want government to look like.
The Indian Act solidified the government's role in the lives of our people and still affects us to this day. But let us not forget that moving beyond the Indian Act is not the end in itself, but rather a means to that end being more prosperous nations where all of us play active roles in our systems of governance with our people, enjoying a better quality of life.
There's a vote on it coming up in the next few months, so it's really important that people have a better idea of what it is they're actually voting on.
People living in the communities, pay attention. Pay attention to what's happening. This is a good thing. Get out and vote.
It's going to be a big change and it's going to be for the better.
We are so capable.
We're in this amazing story that's happening right now, and we have an opportunity to make changes. We have an opportunity to shape what that future will look like.
So, welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Chief Scott McLeod, and tonight we're going to have a presentation, and we're going to entertain some questions and provide answers to the governance agreement that's being proposed. So, if it's your first time listening to some of the details of it, there is lots of information around about it, but we're going to kick off the evening with a presentation from Lisa Restoule Brazier, who is the Regional Communications Coordinator for the Union of Ontario Indians on the governance project. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Lisa.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Scott, Chief, for the introductions, and thank you for inviting us to come and present tonight on the Anishinabek Nation Governance Agreement. A little bit about myself. As the Chief said, my name is Lisa Restoule Brazier, and I have been working at the Union of Ontario Indians for 13 years. And for 12 of those years, I worked with the Restoration of Jurisdiction Department. I was the admin assistant at the negotiation table, so I worked with the negotiators negotiating this agreement halfway through. Before me, there was a lot of other people involved in this project. So moving forward, I just want to say that when I'm talking about this and presenting it to you and going across the Anishinabek Nation territory, I want to first say that as Anishinabek, I wouldn't be here talking to you about this and explaining this to you and promoting it to the Anishinabek citizens if I truly, truly didn't believe in this. Because this is going to affect me just as much as it's going to affect you, my children, my parents, my sisters and brothers, all of us. But going forward, I believe this is a good thing, so that's why I can stand up here and tell you about this agreement. So with that, I'm going to get into the discussion. If there's any questions, please feel free to ask as we go along. I have myself here and another colleague who will be speaking on the fiscal, and as well as the chief and the councillors from Nipissing here to answer any questions. So the Anishinabek Nation Governance Agreement has been 25 years in the making. Oh, come on. It's not working. We can move this over there. I think. Oh, sorry, technical. All right. Is there any way I can move this over here? Okay. Did you do that or me? You did. Oh, okay. So the Anishinabek Nation Governance Agreement is an agreement between the Anishinabek Nation First Nations, the Anishinabek Nation, and Canada, the federal government.
Question. Who is the Anishinabek Nation?
The Anishinabek Nation is the 39 First Nations, well, the 40 First Nations in the Anishinabek Nation territory. From Northern Superior to Lake Huron to Southwest region and the four corners of Ontario. Okay? And in this agreement, we are looking at 4 lawmaking authorities only. We're not getting completely out of the Indian Act. This is the areas that we were directed to negotiate. So that includes language and culture, citizenship, leadership selection, and management and operation. Under this agreement, what we've been able to do with Canada is negotiate and also educate and make them accept that we have always had the inherent right to govern ourselves. And Canada is saying under this agreement that they finally recognize that and that they're going to step out of the way and let us do what we've said we've always had the right to do, and that is make our own laws and to govern ourselves. Under this agreement, it also provides more funding to be able to do that, to be able to govern effectively for our citizens and for our nation. And without this agreement, without this negotiated agreement between Canada and the Anishinabek Nation, Canada could step in and assert their jurisdiction over us as they have always done in the past. So many times, First Nations have made decisions and laws, and where do we end up? We end up in court. We end up fighting and right to the Supreme Court, which takes up millions of dollars that First Nations don't even have or have to use to fight these battles, and they're usually individual First Nations, and time. Sometimes it's 20, 25 years before we get a decision. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. But under this agreement, Canada is saying that they are going to step out of the way and they are going to recognize that we have the lawmaking power in these 4 areas. So the first area is language and culture. Now, why have a language and culture law? A lot of First Nations are going back to implementing our ceremonies and our language. As the other night when I was in Nipissing, I see in your stop signs you have Anishinabek name. Sorry, I ate too fast. You can see the Ojibwe words. I'll just try that one. And so Nipissing is implementing that already. But something to take even further is that in your law you can say, look at making sure that our language and culture are protected, and that the First Nation is really instilling it back into our community. We could say, plan in 20 years that 50% of the community is going to be speaking the language, or that if you want to work in the community, in one of the offices or whatever, that you have to take classes. Like we can start implementing that in the laws. Also, this law, Nipissing is under the Anishinabek education system, and this law supports the education laws that are going forward. So in making sure that our children learn the language, and making sure that our children learn the culture of Nipissing First Nation. So it's really important. And something else that really stands out with this kind of law is the funding that comes along with it. In this First Nation and right across the Anishinabek territory, our language keepers and our knowledge keepers are getting older. We're losing them. But as I've been saying, I can go to school and I can get my BEd, and I can go take my language course at Lakehead University, and I can come back and say I'm qualified under the province to teach. Except I don't know my language. So how can I possibly teach? But it's the citizens, it's our elders who have that knowledge. And the problem that we have is that we don't pay them. Everybody needs to live. Everybody has bills. And you know what? Our language keepers and our knowledge keepers, what the value of what they have is priceless. So what at least we can do is start paying our people to educate us, because what we have in place right now, we're losing everything. So this agreement will provide the funding to do that. Not just in the schools, but it's happening, it's happening right here in Nipissing. We have teachers right here that have gone through this high school who are now teaching your language program to adults. That's awesome. Nipissing is breaking so much, breaking the ground for so many, and being the example of what can be done. So but to have the law instilled in the people, so that when moving forward, 5 years from now, the people 5 years from now will know, 20 years from now, people will know what these laws are and why they're in place. So the next area is citizenship law. Now, to be very clear, this is not about status. So under this law, we are not granting status. Canada wouldn't give up the definition and the rights and responsibilities that come with status as far as Canada is concerned. But just also be very aware that status is a definition under the Indian Act and under INAC and under the federal government. Status does not determine who you are as Anishinaabe. Anishinaabe is Anishinaabe. So under this citizenship law, we will determine who our citizens are. No more Bill 61, 62, whatever, Z25. No more of that. We'll decide who our citizens are, and we'll also in this law decide what their responsibilities are, what their privileges are in Nipissing, how to become a citizen. That will all. And Nipissing actually has a really good membership code right now, and so it's very easy for Nipissing to take that code, tweak it, do whatever you need to do, and that's your law. Like I said, Nipissing has done so much, has already done so much of this work, and the funding is there to either help implement it or make it better or change it, whatever you want. But that's what that's about. We have a community member in Dohis, and she went her whole life. She didn't have status. Her husband enfranchised, but she grew up. Her first language is Ojibwe, and it wasn't until Bill C-31 or something came through that she got recognized as a status Indian. But she was Anishinaabe, born and raised. So imagine having to go through your whole life and not being able to say that you're from Dohis and you're Anishinaabe because the definition, you didn't fit that definition. We've got to get out of that, because status Indians will eventually all end up disappearing. But citizens of Nipissing will not. So that's why we need to determine our own citizens. Now also, moving forward in other areas of jurisdiction, right now we get funded for status Indians under INAC. Moving forward, when Nipissing, for example, says, or INAC says, you have 500 people on your status, and so we're going to fund for 500 people. But Nipissing says, no, we have 3,000 people on our list, on our citizenship list, and that's the funding we want. So moving forward, that's what we're going to use to push Canada to provide the appropriate funding to make sure that all of our citizens, Nipissing citizens, have the best programs and services available. So that's how important this is. Citizenship is one, so that we know who we are, and that we're never going to go away, and that Canada has a fiduciary responsibility to provide the funding for the programs and services to our citizens. Election laws. So Nipissing has, I'm saying all the things that is going to fall under this agreement, except Nipissing has all of them. But that's good. That's good. Nipissing has an election code, and under it's very simple. If it's working for Nipissing, there can be consultations with the First Nations, and all you have to do is take your election code and flip it, and it's a law, a legal law. Recognized in Canada, recognized more importantly by yous. Now, in your law, everything that you have in your election code right now can be in your law. How long the term is, who can run for office, what happens if a position is vacated. How do you fill that? So those are some of the things that can go in your law, which Nipissing already has. The difference is that under the, and most First Nations are under the INAC elections, which is 2 years. A lot of First Nations are under election codes and operate on their own, except that initially all of those codes and the reports of any elections have to be sent to INAC. So we're still reporting to INAC. Under these laws, the report goes back to the citizens. It doesn't go to INAC. INAC has no say on how your officials are elected, and the only ones that have any say about any of these areas in these laws are the citizens of Nipissing. So it is truly Nipissing's laws. Once again, operations and management, which is, for example, your Financial Management Act, which I'd actually like Scott to come up, Chief to come up and speak about what Nipissing has in place, because you're above and beyond any kind of law that could be made here. Nipissing, again, is breaking ground for First Nations, leading the way on what can be done moving forward. So I'd like the Chief to come up and speak about what's in place for Nipissing right now. Yes?
Who signs the laws?
Who signs the laws?
Who decides what are going to become laws? Is it the people or is it the Chief Council?
Under your Constitution, and if you haven't seen your Constitution, you should get a copy of your Constitution. It should outline your the lawmaking process for Nipissing First Nation. So, for example, I'm almost 100% sure, but maybe the Chief could speak to that, but election laws must be developed and ratified by the people. They can't be changed every time there's a new council. What I know about constitutions and finances is anything over a certain amount has to be brought to the people. But I would really encourage you to look at your constitution, and Scott or Dwayne can address those specific questions for Nipissing. Yes?
Where do you find the Constitution?
Jen said it's on the website, Nipissing First Nation website, and Jen can provide copies. Okay.
Okay, so yeah, Lisa touched on a few areas. When it comes to lawmaking, depending on which laws we're talking about, if they're fairly some of the bigger laws, like if we're talking about our election code, or if we're talking about anything that has any significant impact to the community, those will be done through consultation and ratification. So there's a process in place for that already, where we consult. And for election code, we're actually going through the process right now of amending it. So those we have a committee that looks at consults with the community, has input from the community. They come up with the suggestions for changes to the election code or the soon-to-be election law. and then it's voted on and passed through a public ratification. Smaller laws can be done just through posting, consultation through media, through news releases, with say I think it's a 21-day period of commenting, and then it's passed at chief and council. But those are for like smaller, minor laws. But the bigger ones that we're talking about here are done through a ratification vote process. Now, Lisa talked about the areas, and one of the areas is financial law. We're way ahead of the curve on that one. We got involved with it's the First Nation financial certification system that is nationwide. We're the fourth First Nation community in Canada and the first in Ontario to pass, to attain the level of financial certification that we have. It's the highest level of certification, which does a lot of things for us. The main points of our financial laws is that it guarantees and ensures transparency to our public, that the laws are so strict with all the checks and balances to avoid any type of corruption or any type of mishandling, misappropriation of funding, all that kind of stuff. It's protected by these laws. But it also does another thing. When we go to invest in companies or to look for other sources of revenue for our community, that assures them that we are rock solid when it comes to our financials, and it opens many more doors for us, as well as with government. So when we look to the government to get into a 10-year funding grant system where we can guarantee the funds to come into band support for 10 years, that was the catalyst for getting us to that point, because they knew all our books in order, and we had the financial laws to make sure our checks and balances and everything was in place. And that was no easy task. That took Tammy Solis, our financial director, and her team quite a few years to go through the rigors of achieving that certification. And it's been what, 2 years now, Blaine, since we've had that financial certification, and we're quite proud of it, to be the first in Ontario and the fourth in Canada. So as Lisa mentioned, these areas here in governance, we're already doing them. Nipissing has never really waited for government agreements or anything like that. We've taken the initiative on our own, and we are in 3 areas we have completed, but the 4th area, just to correct Lisa, on our citizenship is just in the process of being, we started that about 6-8 months ago, and we've got a committee struck and we're working through it. The beauty of this agreement for us is it's the things that we're already doing to help us get out of the entanglement of the Indian Act, but it's going to give us the financial backing, because right now we're spending our own money. We're spending money that we make from own source revenue, whether it be money from interest from the land claim to be able to do some of this work. We won't have to spend that money. That money can go stay within the community for other things, to provide other services. So now we're going to have the financial resources with this, so we can continue to do that work we're already doing, but we're going to be using it. And I don't want to say it's government money, because it's not government money. It's money that is owed to us, and it's our money. And so that's why I like to see this come in place, is that so we can continue to do the work and continue to be a leader in First Nation community, but we can do it with the money that was supposed to come to us in the first place. So this is about governance, and it's about delivering services to our community members and providing better services to the ones that live off reserve as well as the ones that live on reserve. So that's what this is about, and it's really just specific to these 4 areas that we're talking about. A couple of things I do want to point out. In no way is this complete on its own self-government. It's not complete on its own, practicing our sovereignty. But it is a start, And it's the first step to get away from the Indian Act, which handcuffs us on a lot of things and allows us the autonomy to make those decisions and report to you, not report to Indian Affairs or any other government. Our reporting will be, and our accountability will be always to the membership. So that's how this is going to change for the citizens of Nipissing First Nation.
For that, Chief. Yes, and you're correct that you don't have a citizenship code. I think I was getting it mixed up with your transfer policy. So, because you stole a couple of my sisters. But that's another story. Okay. So, also in this agreement, there is a new intergovernmental forum, something that no other self-government agreement, no other agreement in Canada has. The Anishinabek Nation, we are the only ones right now to have this. And what this is a forum for us to meet with the political leaders of Canada, whether it be ministers, and I'll say it, the position of the Anishinabek Nation is that one day, one of these times, it's going to be meet with the Prime Minister to deal with our issues. We are a nation, and it should be a nation to nation. But right now, the way we sit, so we have this in our agreement. Every First Nation, every agreement across Canada should have it. Canada didn't want this at first, but the negotiators fought really hard for it. Because the way it works right now, we might get a meeting with the minister in 4 months, 6 months, half an hour, and then the morning of, I can't make it, so I'm sending my deputy. That's not true nation-to-nation governance. So this will be set up once the government, the Anishinabek Nation government is set up, and it can be by, twice a year, 3 times a year, however it's set up. And that's not just to meet with the Minister of Indian Affairs. That could be the Minister of Finance, Education, whatever issues we have as an Anishinabek Nation, that's who we need to talk to. So, because the Minister of Indian Affairs doesn't know a lot about what affects us on our First Nations. So under this agreement as well, we will be forming the Anishinabek Nation government. Under this government will be set up by the First Nations who ratify this agreement. Now, so the ones that ratify this agreement will have either a representative, however your First Nation decides who that representative is, and they will form the government. But the First Nation is paramount. Nipissing First Nation is here. The Anishinabek Nation government is here. No one is going to tell Nipissing what to do. Nipissing has full authority, full autonomy. The government is there to assist the First Nations on whatever issues that come forward. And it could be adjudication, or it could be tribunals, appeals and redress to deal with things. Why have 40 appeals and redress bodies when we can have one at the Anishinabek Nation? That's an example of what the Anishinabek Nation government could do. We could come up with, right now we have a citizenship law, draft law at the Anishinabek Nation. A First Nation could look at that and say, yeah, I think we're going to use that, or say, no, we're going to make our own. So the First Nations will tell the Anishinabek Nation government what it wants it to do. And if the First Nation wants to do everything on its own, that's okay. But there is power in numbers. So the Anishinabek Nation government will always be there for the First Nations. Also under this agreement, each First Nation and the Anishinabek Nation will have the same legal status and capacity as any other government. Because right now, we are wards under the Indian Act. We don't have authority. I mean, we have started, there was one time that we couldn't even sign our own contracts. But now, under this agreement, we will have full control over any kind of dealings we make. A lot of First Nations have to put their money in trust because INAC says so, or we have to put our money, into corporations. We won't have to do that anymore because we will have the legal status to be able to operate as a government, a legal government, and so will the Anishinabek Nation government. And also, to be very, very clear, the Union of Ontario Indians will not be the government. The Union of Ontario Indians is a secretariat. It's an advocacy body for the First Nations. So for the First Nations who ratify this agreement, if there's 20, there's 20 that remain. The Union of Ontario Indians is still an advocate for the 40 First Nations of the Anishinabek Nation. They will continue to provide the advocacy in lands and health, employment, provide education, the education AEI, all of those areas. But it will not be the government, and where the government will sit is going to be decided by the First Nations who ratify this agreement. Could be split into the four regions. It could be here. Just as the KEB office is set up here, I don't know what the process is. That's going to be up to the First Nations that ratify. There could be a tender for First Nations to build a building for the government. So just to be very clear, the Union of Ontario Indians will continue to exist as long as the chiefs say so. It's an incorporated body, but it will not be the government. Under this agreement, there's also a new fiscal framework. Fred Bellefeuille will get more into the fiscal part of it and explain the fiscal transfer agreement and the amounts that come with that. But this agreement will be a 5-year funding agreement. We will see 7 times more funding, and Fred will get into that more. And what we, of course, will use with this funding will be to implement the laws, to provide better governance programs and services, and just to be able to, for the First Nations to be able to provide these programs and services to their citizens. Yes? No. There's 2 levels, but I'm going to let Fred speak to that right as soon as I'm done. We're going to be getting into fiscal. Okay? Is that all right? Okay. Is it a one-time name? So a couple of points to remember. Oh, sorry, yes.
Is our individual rights being taken away by signing this on this?
No.
So, for instance, in the Chief Council, decide on something that's important to us, like our border.
Oh, no. This has nothing to do with the treaty annuity. The court case or anything. This agreement will not affect your treaty rights. It's not a treaty. It will not change anything in the treaty. Your hunting and fishing rights, your whatever the rules are in Nipissing, whatever laws have been applied. But the treaty annuity has nothing to do with this agreement.
But down the road, could it to the Chief Council take our, let's say you got $4 a year. That's going on here. Could the Chief Council take that money and do what they want with it on their own without our individual consent?
No, you have more of a legal perspective on this, so I'll let him talk and then I'll answer.
Good evening, everybody. Good question about treaty. How does this impact treaty and treaty rights? First of all, understanding treaty and Aboriginal rights. It's protected by Section 35 of the Constitution. What does that mean when it says that? It means that any regulation, policy, law that interferes with it is of no force and effect. It's part of the highest law in Canada, treaty and Aboriginal rights. So no matter what this agreement says, they won't impact treaty and Aboriginal rights because this is less than the treaty-protected rights under Section 35 and Aboriginal rights. So there's no impact. And in fact, what the governance agreement says to bring clarity to that is it shall not interfere with treaty and Aboriginal rights or rights under Section 35. So that's the way it is. So like for example, we don't have to get fishing licenses because we have that treaty right. There's a law that says all Ontarians have to have fishing licenses. That doesn't apply to us, that law, because our treaty law pushes it down. It bumps it out of the way. So if there's anything in this, and there isn't, I've read it myself, that interferes with the treaty right, it would bump it down anyway because it overrides it, because it's constitutionally protected. That's what that means.
As for your question on, let's say the annuities, and I don't want to start any rumors here. Let's just be clear on that. We're no closer to an annuities settlement than we were, 3 months ago, and we have no idea what that's going to look like. But whatever it looks like, whatever settlement it comes to, the way that's going to be dealt with is through public consultation, just like everything else that we do in this community. So it's not going to be strictly a chief and council decision as to what would be done with if we do get any funds through annuities. And there may be, I'm not sure, but there may be conditions to what that money can be used for. I'm not sure what the claim settlement's going to look like. But the way we do business in Nipissing is always through consultation, just like with the land code and the land claim and everything else. So that'll be done through a series of public consultations as to how the money is appropriated.
I have a question. The A&G Act basically covers every part except for one entity.
Every part except what?
It covers like land. It covers backlists and all other centers. What sort of restrictions would AFGA would cover and not? It only covers those 4 areas.
Yeah, it just the 4 areas that Lisa has spelled out in her presentation. That's the only areas that it covers. But the interesting part about one of those 4 areas is the language and culture, and that's particularly interesting to us, as Lisa had mentioned, obviously the importance of retaining our language and culture. But it's important to note that in the Indian Act, which we're presently under, there is absolutely no mention of protection of language and culture. In fact, the Indian Act was designed to get rid of our language and culture. So that's another important fact to remember with this governance agreement, is that it specifically allows us to create laws for the protection of our language and culture.
And just when we're talking about our Aboriginal treaty rights, it's under Chapter 3, Section 3.2, if you want to see the agreement on that. And Chapter 5 speaks specifically about the First Nation government and what is covered in Chapter 5 for First Nations. And Chapter 4 is on the Anishinabek Nation government. So Chapter 4 is the Anishinabek Nation government. Chapter 5 is the Anishinabek Nation, the First Nation governments, and the 4 lawmaking authorities. And just to be clear, when you read these and we talk about the laws, under each section of these laws in this agreement, it'll state that if there's a conflict between the federal or provincial laws or the Anishinabek laws, the First Nations laws will be paramount, will overrule, supersede all others. Yes?
Well, how do you do that when we're really still under the government? We're not on our own, like self-government. We're under the government still. So I don't know why we're going from the Indian Act to this when they haven't even fulfilled those promises with TRC, all this stuff. There are reserves that are going to be left behind because they don't have, like, the police station, they don't have. So what's going to happen to them? They're going to get a one-time payment and then you're just going to let them go?
No, each First Nation will decide and has decided on their own if they are ready to vote on this agreement. Each First Nation, with respect, it's whatever they choose right now. And if a First Nation has chosen not to be part of this agreement at this time to run a vote, they can come on at any time.
I heard a couple months ago, there's some of your comfort in downtown.
Oh yes, if a First Nation wants to come under the agreement and they ratify this by their citizens and they start receiving the funding, and after 3 or 4 years they decide this isn't working for us, Nipissing First Nation, I think we need to get out. It's up to Nipissing First Nation how they want to get out. There's nothing in the agreement that says how you get in or, how you get out. So it's up to Nipissing First Nation. But a First Nation can opt out. Nobody, you can't be held hostage to this agreement.
Because it says under the 10-year thing, so for the implementation, there is a process of 10 years.
Yeah. There is an implementation plan. And under the implementation plan, which Fred will speak more about, there's one-time funding, and it's for 10 years. So you can use this. You can use this money for 10 years. If you spend it all in the first year, that's up to each First Nation. That's the decision of each First Nation. Now, if you spend all that money, and like I said, whenever a First Nation chooses to get out, they can get out. Now, if a First Nation ratifies this and decides after 4 years or 5 years they want out, they go back to the Indian Act, and they become an Indian Act band, and they go back to the funding levels that they were receiving as an Indian Act band.
The other thing I'm getting at, just to be real specific, is the issue of sovereignty. So every everyday person, that's the main concern. We've lost a lot of rights with the treaties, as I mentioned. All things have been set up. When it comes down to it, what's left in itself is paper. That's all that's left. So when that's not even there, how will it be different than the rest of Canada?
Well, I'll let the chief respond, but my first response to that is that under this Anishinabek Nation governance agreement, and as the Anishinabek Nation government, and as a First Nation government, we'll never let that happen. The strength will be in the government and the Anishinabek Nation to make sure that the treaties are never eroded anymore, and that they actually start fulfilling their treaty promises that they've taken away. But I'll let the chief point to.
Yeah, there's a couple things that you said that I want to touch on. The first is, why would we move from one piece of legislation to another? The main reason for that is that in the current legislation, the Indian Act, we're not given the powers to make decisions on our own. They have to be all reported and passed through Indian Affairs and approved. And in some cases, the way the government is, it takes a very long process to get things done. They'll sit and get shuffled around through departments or whatever. And we don't really have any decision-making power. Is this sovereignty? Not quite. But it's a step towards sovereignty because we're getting out of that archaic, oppressive Indian Act. We're moving into another act that's going to be called the Anishinabek Governance Act, which is, you're right, it's still under the federal umbrella, but it passes the power of decision-making to the communities and stays out of our affairs. So no longer is the reporting there to, like I said earlier, to Indian Affairs. It's the reporting is to our people, and that's who we are going to be accountable to. So is it true sovereignty? Is it true self-government? Not yet, but it's more. It's closer to that than the Indian Act. And the way I explain this to my son, who's about 25 years old, and he's a brown belt in jiu-jitsu, and he takes it really seriously, and it's a really, really nice sport to watch. And if you've ever seen a match, there's no one move that, if you're pinned to the ground, that you get out from underneath your opponent when he's on top of you. And you constantly shift, you readjust, you do these things until you're finally in a position to make that move to flip your opponent over and get on top. And that's essentially what we're doing here as First Nations. We know there's no silver bullet to this. But when we see opportunities that put us in a better advantage to move forward and fight the fight that we're trying to achieve here, we take those advantages. And that's how I see it. It's not the end-all, be-all answer to all our issues and all our problems with the federal government today, but it puts us in a better position to deal, especially with citizenship, as Lisa talked about before, because although it doesn't deal with status right now, when we implement citizenship laws for our members to say, you know what, no blood quantum rule, we're going with one parent rule. That's our law. Once we make that law and they recognize that we have the powers to make laws, we're in a better position to fight for our kids to maintain status down the road. So this is building a foundation of getting back our sovereignty. It's not getting our sovereignty in one fell swoop by any means, or neither is it self-government totally in one move, but it moves us closer. And I think that's the key. We could sit here for another 30 years, for another 60 years, waiting for the perfect plan, and I'll tell you what, it's never going to come. So we have to take opportunities, as small or big as they are, when they come, and move forward. Staying under the Indian Act, to me, is not the answer. So that's why I'm pushing for this, and I think this is a good idea. So I'm behind it. I've looked at this thing 100 different ways. I've listened to different lawyers and different opinions, and I really truly believe that this is better than staying at status quo.
Okay, are we, as a people, like, are we giving up our nation, like Indigenous people of Canada, our nation? Are we giving up that international nation? And also, are we agreeing to be incorporated? If we sign this, incorporated.
Oh. Are we giving up our nationhood by coming and signing on an agreement or voting on an agreement? No, by doing nothing, by staying under the Indian Act, we're doing what you're talking about. So we have to move forward. Like the chief was saying, I agree with him 100%. You have to look for opportunities to move forward without jeopardizing the future. And that's exactly the call we're making right now. And nationhood at an international level, that was the other part of your question. The United States, for example, doesn't wait for Canada to say, oh, you're a nation. The United States does that on their own. Canada does it on its own. We have to do it on our own. And that's what we're doing. The agreement really is Canada's recognition of some of that. And like what Scott was saying, we have to take opportunities where we see them and move on. That's basically my view on that. And if one day there is complete autonomy and sovereignty out there, that is still there right now today. It'll be there tomorrow. If we vote yes on the agreement, it'll still be there then. And we can still move on.
Yeah. Another point I'd like to make on the sovereignty issue, and I think it's really important to understand that the Canadian Constitution is not ours, okay? But Section 35 is important, not because of what most Canadians think. Most Canadians think that Section 35 gives us our rights. Section 35 of the Constitution recognizes that we have the right already. That's a big difference. So knowing that, that's where our sovereignty is. Our sovereignty is actually protected within the Canadian Constitution. The way it's written, it recognizes and affirms Aboriginal rights. And so we have to maintain that position that those rights were already there. And so what we're trying to do is, and when you deal with the government, everything has to be done for them to recognize it in their legal mechanism of how they do things, which is through legislation and policies and all those things. That's what they understand. So I look at this governance agreement as the interface between us and the government. This is how they're going to recognize what we're doing, but what we do is what we decide we want to do. as a nation, as a group of people. No longer do we go to them and say, you know, is it okay if we do this? Is it okay if we do that? We're moving out of that and putting that control back into our people. And the people, you guys, are the power. That's the other thing you have to understand. First Nation governments are totally different than Canadian or even American governments. Canadian governments are top down. That's how the power flows. Indigenous governments, our government, is from the bottom up. I don't get to do whatever I want. You guys tell me through consultation what you want me to do, and if I don't do it, then you remove me. And when I look at the Union of Ontario Indians, the Anishinabek Nation, if they don't do what you tell me that I tell them, again, we remove those leaders. It's the power is from the bottom up. But it doesn't mean individual, it means a collective, right? The community. So it's important to note those differences, because when we think about government, we automatically think the way the Canadian government works, but that's not how our government works. Our government works from the grassroots up. So that's the big difference there. Oh, for me.
Okay, Marie was talking about the clan system, okay? The way I figure it should be each reserve pick a grandmother or grandfather in the clan system. And then with the 7 grandfather teachers should be the youth. But only one counselor in there, and they make the rules.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is how this, after this agreement, how the governance is going to look, how the Anishinabek, and that's a good point, because Gord Windevitz has been doing a lot of clan teachings. And the one thing that I've come to realize is that in 2020, it's going to be virtually impossible to reinstill the clan system the way it was 400 years ago. For one, we lost a lot of the knowledge of how it worked at a very intricate level. But number two is that the landscapes have changed, right? The environment has changed. People's values have changed since those. But what we can do is take the values and the principles, the values and the guiding principles from clan systems that we know and we're relearning, and adapt them to what our governance is going to look like, because we are in control now. We don't have to follow Canadian government, federal government type of system. It's going to be up to us as the people within the communities that sign on to this agreement to say, how is this thing going to work? And about 2 weeks ago, we had a governance summit in Sault Ste. Marie, and we went through an exercise all day long. And we went from dotem to dotem, and we talked about the responsibilities of each clan, the Crane clan, the Martin clan, the Deer clan, the Bear clan, and how that was going to work in the formation of government. And so these were grassroots people. They weren't just a bunch of chiefs sitting there trying to figure this out. It was anybody who attended, and a lot of them were grassroots people. And that's the process that I see happening. We determine it. It's not written in there. It's not written in this agreement how it's going to look. And there was a purpose for that. Because we have to include the grassroots people to say, okay, now that we've got this thing, what's it going to look like? How are we going to govern ourselves? What are we going to use as the guiding principles? And so I think the vast majority want to use the clan system, the principles, to be that governing template of how this government is going to look. So you're absolutely right. And those things are being talked about. And they're trying to etch those out. So I'll let you know when they have more of those summits to discuss those kinds of things, and you can partake in there, and you can put your input in there. We got you.
Wow, really, really good questions, everyone. So I only have a couple of more slides, and then we'll move on to the fiscal. But please, again, if you have any questions, just speak up. So some points to remember moving forward with this Anishinabek Nation Governance Agreement is that Section 88 under the Indian Act will not be touched. Our tax exemption will remain. We purposely, of course, don't want to touch this. I mean, from the time I was a little girl, we got to get out of the Indian Act. We've heard that my whole life. Well, we do, except for that part. Until we know for sure that we can negotiate and secure that, that will stay in place. So the Indian Act will still apply, except for those areas dealing with ban lists, elections of chief and councils, and how band meetings are conducted. Because under the Indian Act right now, and some First Nations still use it, the agenda is written in the Indian Act, and First Nations still use it. I was on band council. I didn't even know that was where our agenda came from. So it was actually quite shocking. So if you check the Indian Act, you'll see where band council agendas is written right into the Indian Act. Like, that's how much we were controlled, right from birth to death to in between to governance. So another point is that the OSR discussions that come with fiscal negotiations, and that is now in a moratorium, and Fred will talk more about that. Oh, sorry, own source revenue, OSR is own source revenue, and Fred will talk more about that. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to use the ABCs. So actually, I'm not going to talk about that either because Laura's here and she will be discussing and addressing the ratification process, except to say that it starts February 1st and ends February 29th. So right now, the other night we had reported that there was 26 BCRs. I found out today that First Nation has decided not to run a vote at this time again. So we have 25 First Nations who are running submitted a BCR to run a vote. And they are Curve Lake, Moose Deer Point, Muncie, Delaware, Magnetawan, Shegwenda, Shishigwaning, Ondep-Alnakaning, Wanapate, Nipissing, Dohis, Beausoleil, Namagoosagagan, Pikwakanagan, Whitefish River, Tikmashing, Red Rock, Michwakotten, Alderville, Pickmolbert, BZA, Mississauga number 8, Long Lake 58, Wasaksing, Zivasing, and Fort William. And just real quickly to end on, out of these 25, 17 will be running a vote starting next week. 17 First Nations. The remainder will run, the remainder that have submitted the BCRs will run a vote in May. Yes?
Will the off-reserve membership be affected in any way, like voting on issues on reserve?
Well, for this agreement, First Nation, all citizens will be voting on this agreement. So all Nipissing on and off. But you want to know how these laws and the decisions under this agreement.
To be able to vote on stuff later on down the road, like say 10 years down the road. Can this all change to whatever the council wants?
No.
Whatever they agree on? You don't get any say in that?
No, as was mentioned, like I said, Nipissing has a constitution and they have to follow, you need to get a copy of that constitution and see how your lawmaking processes, what involves community ratification, what kind of communications, and how First Nation citizens, or Nipissing First Nation citizens are included in the decisions that are made. The chief talked about it, that it's through consultation process. So a lot of the power that you're talking about can be addressed, whether it's tweaked into your election laws, what authorities chief and council has, those kind of things. Those are things that you can start looking at if it's not already in your election code, like the authorities of chief and council. But Fred, did you want to expand?
Nipissing First Nation has a constitution. It's called the Nipissing Chinaaquan, the Big Law. And what it says in the Nipissing Chinaaquan is that our citizens are equal. So what that means is that if you're on and off reserve, you should have the same rights. So it's a principle, a fundamental principle in the Constitution. In regards to the impact these laws have, there's a lot of questions about if you're off reserve, does this really affect me? They ask that question. And when it comes to jurisdiction like elections, citizenship, those kind of jurisdictions are mobile. So it's not dependent upon geography. It goes to wherever the person is. So for example, our citizens in the UK, we have band members in the United Kingdom, we have citizens in the United States, Australia. They have the right to vote. This election laws we create under this act will have impact on them, and they, same with the citizenship law, it'll apply for them no matter where they reside.
Okay, but what agreement in place that can change in 10 years?
Only if the people want to, because the Constitution of Nipissing, the Chinookan, says our citizens are to be treated equal. And that means if you live off reserve, you have to treat them the same,
Well, like right now, we're not being treated the same.
No, and a lot of that, what it says in the Constitution is it's subject to reasonable limits. So what that means is that when you have funding that is limited to on-reserve situations, that's a limitation to the application of that.
So that's it for my presentation on the governance agreement. The next part is going to be on the fiscal agreement, and Fred will be talking about that. But again, if you have any other questions, please visit the website, governanceboat.ca, and there's a phone number. But a couple of real quick things before, and maybe Fred will want to address this too. There's been a lot of things going on social media, a lot of videos and people giving their commentary and opinion. One of them was from the Yellowhead Institute. Hayden King wrote basically an opinion piece and an assessment and an analysis of our agreement. And I just wanted to say that just recently, this week, after the AN did respond with the accurate information, they are going to be giving a rebuttal because they did, as he said, they didn't have all the information. So what I want to point out here is a lot of people are giving their opinion and analysis on this, but no one has contacted the restoration of jurisdiction to find out, to ask questions about the agreement. They're just taking it and actually giving out a lot of misinformation. So please, if you have any questions about anything that you've seen or anything that you've heard, that's what Fred and I are here for, and the restoration of jurisdiction, and governanceboat.ca.
So that was, I just wanted to say a few comments. The governance agreement, there was a slide about a thing called the Intergovernmental Forum. And what Lisa said is it's unique across Canada. It's absolutely true. I was at the negotiating table when that was discussed. Canada would not agree to it until the very last of those discussions. What we succeeded at doing really is something unique, and basically what we said is the only way for our people to get their voice at Parliament is by sitting in the front yard with some placards and protesting, or setting up a TV, and that only lasts for so long, and then they tell you to leave. I said, that's not respecting our dignity. So the Intergovernmental Forum is meant to be something that really sets up and supports a government-to-government relationship. Because the way it was under the Indian Act was a government-to-Indian relationship. They dictated who Indians were. So that's a really unique feature. Now, the governance agreement is an agreement that has a start date and it has no end date. Now, the fiscal agreement is different from that. It has a 5-year term, and I'll be talking about that. And the fiscal agreement is basically, in plain language, is a funding agreement. But really, it sets up a different kind of relationship. No. It's that F4, F9. Did it work? Okay, that's the second page. Okay.
Does it work?
So, what is the fiscal agreement? The fiscal agreement is a side agreement that deals with the money part of the governance agreement. It also recognizes the funding arrangements and establishes the process to deliver funding to those First Nations that ratify the governance agreement. And it's, once again, it's an agreement between Canada, the First Nations, and the Anishinabek Nation. What funding does the fiscal agreement provide? The fiscal agreement provides funding for the following two areas. And this was a question earlier. It provides governance funding and one-time implementation money. What's the difference? So the governance funding is annual payments for the next 5 years towards carrying out those 4 areas that Lisa described: citizenship, elections, culture and language, and management and operations of government. So that's on an annual basis over the next 5 years. Why is it 5 years? Because what we said to government at the negotiating table is we want to see what results we can get in the 5 years, and we want to come back to the negotiating table and negotiate a new agreement in 5 years' time with the experience of operating under the governance agreement for 5 years. If we want to change that structure, we can. We can negotiate for a 10-year agreement. We can negotiate for a 20-year agreement, whatever we want. If we want to change the terms, we bring those forward. So, as it stands now, every 5 years we can renew and renegotiate if we find there isn't enough money. The one-time implementation money, what that is the government knows that a lot of First Nations don't have anything. They have no election code, they don't have no membership code, nothing. So this one-time implementation money is a pot of money for each First Nation to do what they feel they have to do now to get things moving and kickstart things. There's a 10-year implementation plan. It's a suggestion for First Nations to follow that and to use that as a roadmap to get things going in governance. The fiscal agreement sets the stage for including funding for future self-governance as well. So, like Scott was saying, this is just one part. It only deals with those 4 areas: elections, citizenship, management and operations of government, culture and language. In the future, we may say to government, we want to negotiate health, social services, whatever it is, and we can use this as a vehicle, this funding agreement, this fiscal agreement, to also facilitate those transfers if we want to. Because the whole idea of these agreements is efficiency. That's why there's a number of First Nations coming together to ratify, because the more we have, the more efficient it is to do a lot of things. If you recall just recently, I don't know if you're aware, but Indian Affairs went from INAC to 2 separate agencies of government. 2 separate. One is fairly big, the other is a little bit smaller. The idea is that as more First Nations get under self-government, there's less and less need to have more bureaucracy at the federal level to support those First Nations, because we'll be doing it ourselves. So that's, in my mind, what they're doing. And there's nothing wrong with that, because we can do it better. Often they actually get in the way. And why get out from the, what's the difference between the Indian Act and the Anishinabek Nation Governance Act, which will eventually come out if we ratify successfully? Why should we just, it's both federal legislation? Because the Indian Act details from the minute you're born to actually the very day you die, what we should be doing. Section 6 describes who's an Indian. So somebody at Indian Affairs, the day you're born, when they get that form, they leaf through it and figure out what they should be doing. And the day you die, somebody goes through your will and determines what they should be doing, and everything in between. The Governance Act, the Anishinabek Nation Governance Act, will not have that detail. All it will say is that refer to the First Nation laws, which are Nipissing laws for us. For those other First Nations, it will be their laws. Now, if Nipissing says this certain law is too big, or that we need to do things differently, combine forces to save money, we can do that through this Anishinabek Nation concept for Anishinabek Nation government. So the fiscal agreement sets the stage for those future jurisdictions that we might want to take on. Now, this is a chart here. It shows, now, the negotiations increased significantly the funding that First Nations receive. It includes funding for up to 7 times the amount that First Nations get. Some get the full 7 times because they're grossly underfunded. Other First Nations who are pushing all the time will not get a full 7 times, but they still get significantly more. And no First Nations get less than 1.7 million annually over the term of the agreement. So 5 years.
Yeah, I think it's because like a community like Nipissing,
Yes.
which is a very small community, I think they've got, I don't know, less than 100 people. And so their band support funding is very minimal. But in this agreement, it's also, what it also does here, and I don't know if we're going to touch on it, but it creates a new floor. And what I mean by that is that no matter what the negotiations are or whatever, there's no band that signs on to this, no First Nation that will receive less than 1.7 million. That's going to be the new floor, right, for band support funding. Currently, ours is about 580,000, right, which is going up exponentially. But those smaller First Nations, ours is only going up by 4.8 times. But some of these smaller bands, in order to get to that 1.7, that new bottom, they're going to be up to 7 times the amount. It's because they're so small. That's why there's a bit of a difference there.
Yes.
But we're a bigger community, obviously. So our value is not going to change as that 7 times. It's going to be more around the 5 times.
And that funding is only for those 4 areas that I talked about. Nipissing and the other First Nations get money for other things like lands, health, social services, which is not part of this agreement. So this is what we just talked about. So Scott explains what Nipissing's offer is, 4.8 times. There's also another pot of money, the one-time implementation money, and I think it's around $548,000. So around $600,000 that each First Nation gets to kickstart things to move on developing those laws. We've been working, as Chief was saying, about our membership and citizenship, our Bendazajig. Actually, in the agreement, you won't find citizenship, you'll find Bendazajig, and it means those who belong. And that's, the term that we've been using in the agreement and in discussions to move things along. When I first heard that in the translation, I took an English translation and connotations to those words, and I thought, that means there's people who don't belong. And I guess you could say that, but that's not the Ojibwe thought behind that word, Bendazajig. It actually means we belong to this land. So, at least that's what I've been told. I'm not a speaker.
Confirmed up here.
Okay. The benefits of the fiscal agreement, First Nations will receive increased funding starting in year 1. The effective date, the start date of the agreement is slated to be April 1st, 2021. And the funding will flow from that point forward. What they did with the education agreement, and the education agreement which Nipissing signed on to and is part of and been using to move things along in a good way without much problem that wasn't anticipated. And it is a sister agreement. 50%, in my opinion, even 60% of the education agreement is the same as the governance agreement. So half of it is basically already agreed to by Nipissing through the education agreement because they're cut from the same cloth. They were negotiated and we shared terms and phrases and clauses to try and do a consistent job. One of the things that First Nations, not Nipissing, but many other First Nations have struggled with is this concept called third-party management. Basically, what INAC does, if you have too much of a deficit, the Indian Affairs will step in and start managing your finances. And it's happened to a number of First Nations. Under the governance agreement, there isn't that process anymore to do third-party management. Because in reality, what the Indian Affairs does is just take the band's money and hires a certified accountant to run the finances. And why couldn't the band do that in the first place to avoid the deficit? And it's just that it's not an effective process to build capacity at different First Nations. It's not part of Nipissing's history to struggle with this. We've always been really good at financial management. As Chief was saying, we're one of the 4 First Nations nationwide that have certified financially. What this means is that we have access to a bond market at an international level. So if we want to borrow money to have huge projects that cost a lot of money, we have that ability. That's one of the options.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yes.
Some of that money has been put to the side by INAC. Is that the reason why most First Nations have struggled with building employment businesses in their First Nations?
So your question is that money, and you're meaning the savings from making Indian Affairs smaller, or what do you?
Like that money gets put aside. Is that the reason why a lot of First Nations have a tough time building businesses and stores and all that?
It's a really good question. Why do some First Nations struggle and others don't? There's a lot of study, and actually, the governance structure, the whole things that we're talking about, governance, meaning elections, citizenship, constitutions, that is the foundation for economic development. That's why these things are so fundamentally important, the 4 areas of law and governance, because it builds a strong foundation to launch economic development activity. So, yes, that's probably why some of those First Nations have struggled, because a lot of the stuff under the Indian Act was simply imposed on the First Nations.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, one of the main reasons why First Nations have always had trouble luring businesses in and creating economic prosperity is because of the Indian Act. So before we got into the Lands Management Act, the Land Code, where we can make our own laws, much like we're talking about here, the Land Code is simply an extension of this. It was preceded this, but it's the same thing, just a different area. And the benefit of that was that we used to have to report, if we wanted to do something on our lands, we had to ask Indian Affairs. And it would take months and months and months, sometimes years, to get anything approved where we can get a business to come in and set up and create jobs and create prosperity. By the time we got approvals, those businesses were gone. They weren't going to wait, that long. They needed to get in business now. With the Lands Management Act, which is essentially the same type of agreement, is that now that decision's here. So if a company comes to us, say Costco comes to us and say, hey, we've got this great opportunity. We want to set up in your community and we want to create jobs. And we say, okay, well that sounds good. So we put it to a public consultation. Hey, what do you guys think? We could turn that over within 1 month's time to say, yep, we got a deal. We couldn't do that with the under the Indian Act. And that was suppressing any type of economic growth within our community. So this is the same thing, but it's more in the area of those 4 areas of language and culture and the election, citizenship, and the governance itself, the operations. So, but to answer your question, the Indian Act has been one of our biggest enemies since day one. And this is why it's crucial. Yes, it's getting into another piece of legislation, but it's getting out of the one that has really held us back. And that, to me, is the first step, to self-government, self-determination, all those things that we're looking for.
Okay, so Lisa talked about and mentioned this thing they call OSR, own source revenue. One thing I wanted to talk about is that the fiscal agreement talks about the fact that supporting the First Nation, its operations, its span, is a shared responsibility. What that means is Indian Affairs contributes money through a fiscal agreement. The First Nation also contributes its money. We've always done that. There's never been enough funding to operate certain programs and services. We've always had to contribute any money we generate. So the agreement talks about that. And what the chiefs has said, because this agreement has been discussed at a higher level than just one chief, like Chief McLeod, it's been a group of chiefs. And what they've said over and over again is if we're waiting for the day where their government says, here's the blank check, fill it out and we'll send you the money, it hasn't come in the past 150 years, and it's not going to come tomorrow. We have to do it ourselves. So the agreement, we acknowledge that it's a shared responsibility. So that's what this slide is about. Some important points to remember. We have a ratification vote coming. We're on the cusp of that February 1st. Today's the 29th. There's a 30-day window to vote electronically. There's also in-person voting, and that's the last week of February. There's also mail-in ballots that if you haven't received one now, you can request to receive one. But there's 3 ways to vote, so there's a lot of opportunity. We have a ratification vote manager. His name is Joe Endawaz. He's from Shishiguani. And he is coordinating the vote by all those First Nations. And he can be reached. There's numbers here. There's numbers on the material. That's in a nutshell the fiscal agreement. Question?
Question about the question.
Yes.
In regard to that slide that was presented earlier, November 26, 2018, moratorium until further notice. Do you want to explain a little bit about that? And
sure.
What is the impact of own source revenue in regards to the funded of the funding model, and how does that impact some of the services that we're looking at increasing, our language, our culture, and all that?
Yes. What the agreement says is that that there's this concept called own source revenue, and it's based on the principle that funding governance and First Nations is a shared responsibility. The government will contribute money, the First Nation contributes money and more for everything they do. So the idea of OSR is that they will factor in what the First Nation contributes towards governance. What the agreement says is that it's a moratorium. If you read it very carefully, what it says is that it requires all parties, meaning all the First Nations, the Anishinabek Nation and Canada, to agree to lift that moratorium in order for it to be in effect. This 5-year agreement is is locked in for 5 years, April 1st of 2021, till 5 years later. They can raise that as a negotiating issue at that time, and we can once again say that we don't want to include that in the agreement and push it. But let me tell you this, as long as Canada is giving money to us, we will never dictate how much they give to us. They will always decide. You know what I say to my kids is that if Daddy's giving you money, he's going to decide how much he gives you. We're not going to have true sovereignty until we have all our own source revenue funding the things we do. That's just the reality.
But I just want to say something too, that it was the chiefs over the 25 years, that was going to be the breaking point. If own source revenue stayed in this agreement like Canada wanted it to, that was going to kibosh this agreement. So Canada finally came forward in November. Minister Bennett announced that it was going to be in a moratorium. And the wording is in the agreement, the Anishinabek Nation agreement. But Scott, if you want to talk about the fiscal part of the schedule.
Yeah, so one of the sticking points, well, first of all, let's be honest. The federal government wanted to have own source revenue in there because at some point they want to talk about getting out of their fiduciary responsibility. Okay? That's really what they're after. And so they said they want to, in the agreement, they want to have the opportunity to discuss that. And that was something that they really wanted. But we said, okay, well, we can have it in there that we'll discuss this, but we're not agreeing to anything. So after 5 years, yeah, we can talk about it, but we're not agreeing to anything. So at first, they had a schedule in the agreement. It was like an appendix, and it said on there, it was an example of over 20 years. The first year, there would be nothing taken off, 2, 3, 4 years, there might be 15, 20% less, till 20 years where, they expect that, we're on our own and we're making enough money. They had that in there as an example, and I said, we're not agreeing to this, so why is this even in there? And they said, there's the moratorium, so you don't have to worry about it. But there's also something in there that we picked up on that said after 5 years, if there's nothing settled, this agreement gets kicked in again. So we said, well, that could be looked at as a legal loophole that it's kicked in with this schedule. So the only way we were going to move forward, and I held Bennett, her feet to the fire on this, and I said, that schedule has to come out. Because the schedule was the mechanism on how that was going to own source. So all it says in there now is that at some point down the road, we're agreeing that we're going to discuss own source revenue. So, which is really, okay, we can agree to that. But we're not agreeing to any 20-year plan or anything like that. So, but the thing about making our own laws now is that once we have this governance agreement in place, we can get together as the First Nations within this Anishinabek Nation, the First Nations that agree to it, and we can pass a law. We can pass a law that says own source revenue will not apply unless every single First Nation member to this agreement is in agreement with, which basically gives it no chance at life. Right? Because, we'd be crazy to agree with it in the first place, but in the second place, if Nipissing says we're dead against it, but it gets voted in because the other communities want it, well, we can pass the law once this is in place that says we have to have consensus on any own source revenue. And that's what my plan is to do, is to lead that charge once we get this thing implemented. So, if that clears that up.
Any other questions?
You talked about our biennial certification. We're certified by.
There's a group called there's actually a higher international body that certifies access to the bond market, international bond market. and they recognize a thing called the Financial Management Board. And Dwayne actually knows much more than I do on this, but they acknowledge that the Financial Management Board can oversee the certification of First Nations in order to be certified to access that bond market. And you might see it sometimes, it's called, is it a AAA rating? Bond rating, AAA bond rating, and we have access to that. Question over here.
Under the Indian transition, there's a section in here, section 80.
Yes.
The Indian one. What is that?
Section 80 talks about management and operations of band government. Basically, it allows them to make regulations that dictates in the Indian Act how a band meeting will be conducted, the rules, agendas, how you call it, the order, all those kind of things. And really, that was designed for one big purpose, and that was to get access to the land. That's why that's there. And to get approval of land transfers back to Canada. And that's what we're getting out of. These are actually the details that people don't understand and talk about. And that's what gave the Indian agent all the control. When our veterans came back from the war, they started to kick out those Indian agents. But we still have these sections, old archaic sections in the Indian Act. So we get out of that, Section 80, along with others that deal with membership, elections, all that stuff. Because even though we have our own election code, we're still under the Indian Act. That's what empowers the custom code. Any other questions?
So if we get those, when you're driving along the highway, you see times where you see crown land.
Yes.
So through this process, will that be changed?
Yes, we have that within our ability. Because our culture and language law can dictate signage. Like we can say that every sign, whether it's Pizza Hut or the name of a town or whatever, we can have in our law that it has to be in Anishinaabe Bellefeuille. You know what one of the chiefs said is that actually my son, my 11 years old son is going to be singing Ojibwe and singing O Canada in Ojibwe. But we actually have our own national anthem. And it's kind of sad. Like I'm proud that my son sings O Canada and Ojibwe, but it's not our national anthem. And it's kind of bad in a way. But our cultural and language laws can actually help to restore that stuff. I'm proud that he's singing in Ojibwe. More questions?
Also, just to add on to that, because the Canadian government wants to hang on to Rupert's land that happened a long time ago. Will that relate that when it comes to Crown land? Like when it comes to the government?
Yeah.
Will we be able to get out of that?
The governance agreement doesn't deal with lands at all. No. It deals with those 4 areas and that's it. But in section 14 of the governance agreement, it actually says future jurisdictions, things we can negotiate down the road. Because we took on education, now we're going to decide upon governance. Down the road, we can also talk about health, social services, lands, whatever it is we want to negotiate. Justice. I just saw in the news that incarceration rates are up to 50% Native, even though we represent, 5% of the population. There's a lot of stuff we have. I tell my kids, there's a lot of things you guys got to work on.
Well, I think that's the other thing I wanted to know is that, just to clarify, that he was looking for, he would have an employment opportunity, related to, say, even the school, that could be a training center for young men or men who come out of incarceration to learn a skill, to become employable.
There was this study by Harvard University called the American Indians Study in Economic Development, Why Tribes Succeed and Some Don't. It was called Reloading the Dice. And what it said is that these things, culture, stable election systems, constitutions, stable citizenship, jurisdiction, supports economic development. The tribes that were succeeding were the tribes that had stability in those areas and were more autonomous in those areas. And all the governance functions are to support economic development. So it's a small thing, and it doesn't connect like logically to economic development in a clear sort of way, but it is the foundation to economic development. What I've brought it down to in my thinking is that the more autonomy at the local level, the more we can tweak things to get the outcomes we want. Right now we have to go to Ottawa for any of the things that we're dealing with here and protest in the front yard to get change. But once we have more and more, like Scott was saying, lands and these other jurisdictions in our control, the more we can tweak them to get the outcomes, which is jobs and other things, protection of our culture, our language, all those things. Other questions? There.
With this in place, will we lose any ability, like, any of the reserves that are involved in this, will we lose any of the ability to have land claim settlements and whatnot?
No. The question is, will this interfere with our ability to settle land claims and those kind of things? Yeah, no, it doesn't deal with lands whatsoever. It deals with elections, citizenship, culture and language, and management and operations of government. What management and operations of government is those things in Section 80 that this lady pointed out to us. It says there, your standard agenda will look like this. There's a roll call. It's micromanaging every part of our life, and it's not in a good way. It's to achieve one outcome, and that's access to our lands. And in fact, the longer we stay in the enact rather, the more we're jeopardizing those things, like land claims and settlements.
Would our reserve lands eventually turn into municipalities?
So the question is, will our reserve lands ever, or will it eventually turn into municipalities? This agreement will not cause that to happen, if that's what you're worried about, because once again, it doesn't deal with lands. If we
that give you the power to do that? That entity, which is the Union of Ontario Indians and reserves that are involved, well, that gives the deciding body, the governing body, power.
No,
More power than an individual.
Right now, the Indian Act, we're not even considered a municipality under the Indian Act. We're considered a band. That's what it calls us. And did you ever look up the definition of band?
Yes.
And what does it say?
Well, we're lower than low. It's the lowest one on the podium.
Yes, we're not even a municipality. It means family grouping. In actually social political order, it's the lowest. It's like, I don't know.
Her answer is no.
Yeah.
No.
Any other questions? Jordan?
What about health services?
Health services?
Things like mental health, suicide, etc.
Yes.
Those are patients who try to see emergency because their services were denied.
So this doesn't cover under the four areas. However, the other thing about this agreement is that we have the ability to use these funds on however we see fit. So if we're already accomplished in some areas outside of these four areas, those support dollars can be used in areas like health or whatever. We can use the funding to where we see fit to improve services throughout our administration, not only in those four areas. The basis is that we make the laws in these four areas and then we get band support funding. But the band support funding, we can use it how we see fit to do all of our governance. So to answer your question in short, yes, we can use some of that money for that.
We have one other presentation to do, and I'd like to get to it. Speaking to the ratification approval process for this agreement will be Laura Comanda. Thank you much, Laura.
Just before Laura starts, just to let you know, we didn't share the actual number, but you probably could do some simple math. But we're not purposely hiding the advance support funding amount, but we are live streaming and we like to keep our business within Nipissing First Nation. But every member is entitled to access that information. So you can see what the new funding advance support numbers will be. That we're not trying to hide that. We're in our financial law systems. Transparency is number one. So, but that's within our First Nation community. So because we're live streaming, that's to the world, right? So just so you know, that information is available.
Hello everyone, my name is Laura Comanda, and I'm the Anishinabek Nation's governance agreement ratification vote process. Ratification vote process negotiated and agreed to by the Anishinabek First Nation and Canada, set out in Chapter 15 of the Anishinabek Nation Governance Agreement. The ratification vote will run in accordance to a ratification process protocol. Who can vote? Members of the Nipissing, members of the First Nations running a ratification vote who are at least 18 years of age or older by the end of the vote period. Your name must be on the list of eligible voters for our First Nation to receive a ballot. Provide your current address to your First Nation communication coordinator or First Nation ratification officer. Voter's identification. Show one of these pieces of identification: your driver's license, provincial ID card, your status card, a passport, your health card, or any other accepted by the ratification officer. First Nation ratification officer. Each First Nation will contract a First Nation ratification officer who will oversee the ratification vote. First Nation ratification officer will appoint a deputy or to assist them. The First Nation is encouraged to update the voters list and update addresses of off-reserve voters. Ways to vote: in person or on reserved voting station. Mail-in ballot up to the close of the voting period. Electronic voting, 1 feather. Our voting period is February 1st to the 29th of 2020. Voters would be able to vote electronically or by mail-in ballot during the entire period. In-person polls will be set up in the First Nation from February 25th to the 29th of 2020. In-person polling will be from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. daily. First Nation ratification threshold: 25% plus one of eligible voters must vote yes, and there must be more yes votes than no votes. Nipissing First Nation, with 2,364 voters, Nipissing will need 591 plus 1 equals 592 yes votes and fewer votes to meet the threshold. Counting the ballots. All ballots will be counted in public at the close of the vote period and polling station. Unofficial votes result will be posted in each First Nation after the ballots are counted. The official vote result will jointly released by the public by the Anishinabek Nation and Canada. Ratification objections. An eligible voter may file a written objection challenging the ability of the ratification vote within 10 days following the end of the vote period. At First Nations, official vote results will not be announced until after the objection is resolved by the appeal board. My name is Laura Comanda. My telephone is 705-753-2050. My extension is 1221. The toll-free number is 1-833-297-9850, and the email is governancevote@nfn.ca. Thank you. Having down the village, because we have mail-in ballots, plus we also have online voting, but we have in the council chambers at the ban office for 5 days. If anyone wants to come, pardon?
Go to your village, eh?
Yes.
Thank you.